Okay, so in this chapter, we're talking about how research studies are designed, how we're going to develop a strategy to build a research project, and look at some of the common errors that are made in research projects. So one way that we need to start to think about a research project once we have it in mind is start to think about triangulation, because to the extent that you have some triangulation, you're creating more certainty about your research results. Triangulation basically involves looking at something from multiple points of view, multiple perspectives, multiple methods as a way to improve your accuracy. So if we're looking at the triangulation of measures, essentially what I'm saying is that I have a quantitative method and I've got multiple variables that are trying to capture something like poverty. In the triangulation of observers, much like this picture right here, I have three different individuals who are taking notes, let's say, from some person sharing their experiences. Yet all three of these individuals have different biases, different different issues, and so they're obviously going to record different things when this person is sharing their experiences. So combining all three of these individuals' notes about this experience being shared, they're going to reveal different things. In the triangulation of theory, you don't see this too often, but what you're seeing here is you're looking at multiple methodological perspectives. So, for instance, I could be an economist who looks at poverty as having been caused by poor, low education levels, but then I could also say, add on to it a Marxist interpretation and say it's also because people don't have enough accumulation of capital, or they work for an employer who's particularly oppressive. And then finally, I could have some triangulation of method. That would involve essentially me mixing both qualitative and quantitative techniques together. Looking at cases and then also looking at, numbers. Now, in this qualitative and quantitative orientations, I need to look at the kinds of data I have. Is it the case that I have soft data? If it's soft data, I'm looking at words, I'm looking at sentences, experiences shared, versus hard data, which, because it's a number, is a little bit less controversial, hopefully. In the assumptions about social life, am I looking at things from a positivist perspective, where I say that I'm looking at this from a numeric standpoint, looking at it from truths, again, versus the interpretive or the critical, which are then subject to opinions and open to debate? Now, incredibly important is for you to ask yourself, what is it that you're trying to accomplish in a study? Are you trying to test a hypothesis, right? If you do something, will this certain other event occur? Or are you trying to develop a hypothesis? Now, you typically see hypothesis testing in more mature fields that we know a great deal more about what's generally happening between variables. But you may not know what is exactly going on because not a lot of research has been done. And so if that's the case, then you need to spend a little bit more time doing some hypothesis development, talking a little bit more in descriptive terms. And then we have differences in the type of logic, systematic versus some ongoing practice, right? What is going to be the process in which I start to think about the relationship between my variables? So what that does is it then brings us back to this idea of the reconstructed logic versus the logic in practice. In the reconstructed logic, what I'm doing is I'm trying to standardize things. I'm trying to codify my research and look, being incredibly precise about how one thing is linked to another. versus my logic in practice, where essentially what I'm doing is I'm learning based on implicit knowledge. I'm, an internship or an apprenticeship kind of model, right, where I'm learning in practice. Now, what you just saw that I was also kind of referring to here was also the distinction between linear and nonlinear paths of research. In the linear path of research, what I'm essentially talking about here is then how the logic follows a straight line where it's basically a series of arrows from one variable to the next to the next. In my nonlinear paths of research, things aren't as clear why one variable is linked to another. And because it's less clear, then the logic can at times become a little bit, or seem a little bit cyclical, and the logic can also appear iterative, meaning it occurs in stages. Objectivity, having an objective and having integrity in the research you're doing. Well, this is, I'm not going to expand too much more on this. This should be hopefully pretty obvious about what we're looking at here. In quantitative research, I need to know that the data is reliable. In qualitative research, it's important that the researcher be objective and not come into it with an agenda. And then there's this whole thing of how do I come up with the research topic itself? Is it something that I already had thought about previously? Is it pre-planned? Or, and that's much of like what I'm forcing you to do in your RPAs, versus is it a question that you develop over time after having looked at the literature and looked at the data? That's a little bit more for advanced researchers or researchers in newly developing fields. Not something that we're doing really too much in this class. I'd encourage you, if you're looking at this, what is this on? Page 171, if you wanted to look at all these different ways that we think about research topics and why we're interested in specific things. It's hard for me to say about why you come at something in one particular way versus another. It's really up to you, and it's not really part of the process I would think too much about. But incredibly important is then how you start to narrow down that research question. And I would say this is probably the most common error that individuals have when looking at research. You need to have it, you can't just say, for instance, that you're interested in puppies, right? You need to tell me, and you want to describe how puppies are adopted. Rather, I need to say something about, am I talking about a particular geographical community? Am I talking about a particular time period? Am I talking about particular kinds of people that want to adopt puppies? These would all be important, and they really refine what I'm looking at and really try to dig at what specifically is the causal relationship between things. If there's any doubt about what I'm talking about here, I would encourage you to look at that box 6.2. Especially now that you've had this chapter, I will start to grade you based on your research question, not containing being a good versus a bad research question. I've done my best to give you some tips on your proposals about what you need to be careful about to make your research question better, but I would strongly encourage you to look at this slide and make sure that your research question doesn't commit one of these errors. If you're in doubt, email me. The sooner the better, and we can go back to your research question and try to refine it a little bit further. Because remember, at this point, I'm approving of the research topic, but not necessarily the research question. Okay. These are distinctions in between qualitative and quantitative research. I would presume that you already know who you are if you're focusing on one over the other, so I'm not going to really spend too much time on this slide. But it's not too simple to say quantitative is dealing with numeric positive aspects and the qualitative research is dealing with a lot of things that are non-numeric and interpretive in their very nature. Okay. In grounded theory, what we're talking about here is then, how do I build the theory from the data? So you're looking at the data first and you're building theory from it. The advantage of that is you actually get to be quite flexible. You get to focus on capturing the data and then building a story around that data. But what is essential about things is that you introduce some context. So I need to have some understanding of the social system that exists around the data, because that's going to really contribute to my interpretation, my establishment of a causal relationship existing between variables. In bricolage, what we're basically then doing is we're improvising. We're improvising and we're essentially drawing on diverse sources, diverse materials, and I'm trying to understand something in an incredibly creative way by drawing on these diverse materials. Essentially, like if I wanted to understand how do people cheat on taxes, people aren't going to probably tell me how they actually cheat on taxes, right? Whether they actually do it or not. Instead, to conduct bricolage, what I'd have to do is start to think about, well, what do people who engage in tax fraud, what do they do? Maybe they buy lots of boats, really fancy boats. Well, then that would be a way that I could kind of find a diverse way in which to understand people cheating on their taxes is by how many boats are bought by a particular community. In my case and process here, in the case study approach, I'm obviously just looking at cases, a specific set of individuals, a specific geographical area or time frame. But in the process, what I'm looking at here is how the issue is evolving over time. So for instance, I could look at how people's opinions of abortion have changed since Roe v. Wade or something like that. In the interpretation process, what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at my first, second, and third order interpretations. An example of this would be I could ask people, what do people think of the governor's performance since being elected? And people would just say, he's doing a great job. I really like his XYZ policy. Or I think he's doing a horrible job because he didn't do this, right? That would be first order interpretation is I'm just looking at the point of view of the person who's giving me the answer. Now, in second order interpretation, what I'm doing is, let's say I'm a political scientist, and someone says, the governor's doing a horrible job because they didn't pass comprehensive tax policy. Well, then what I could do as a political scientist is say, well, it never actually reached the governor's desk. The governor didn't have any role in it because the legislature didn't pass the bill. Well, then having blamed the president for it, or the governor for it, it's not really the governor's fault. And then finally, in the third order interpretation, what I'm looking at here is the readers of the research report are actually making the qualitative interpretations of the process that's going on. Variables. These are empirical measures. They take on multiple values. This would be things like there's a finitely large number of variables that exist between 0 and 10, right? There's a finitely large number, but a large number of numbers that exist between 0 and 10, if we're talking about decimals existing and whatnot. But in attributes, what we're talking about here is starting to categorize things, right? I could say whole numbers versus non-whole numbers. I could say even numbers versus odd numbers, prime numbers versus non-prime numbers, right? Creating categories for these kinds of things. Now, incredibly important behind this is then the nature of the variable and looking at things then as either independent or dependent variables. Independent variables are the things that are doing the effecting. They're the things that are hopefully what you're trying to do is causing the dependent variable to change. So the dependent variable is the one that is affected. So the independent variable is affecting the dependent variable, the one that's affected. Now you also then need to be careful then of there not being an intervening variable existing. So for instance, what if my dependent variable was people who drown? And what if I said that my independent variable was people eating ice cream? So I would want to create a story that says eating ice cream causes people to drown. It turns out that they probably are both going up at a certain point, right, in a certain time of the year. But I could just say, yes, both of them are going up in June, in July, in August, that people eat more ice cream and people drown more. But obviously what I'm also implying here is that it's not necessarily a causal relationship between the two, unless you're swimming within 30 minutes of having eaten that ice cream. Most of them are not. Rather, what we're seeing is actually the existence of an intervening variable, which then says that the causal relationship between the independent and the dependent variable isn't the thing that actually exists. The intervening variable would be, it's summer. More people eat ice cream, more people go swimming. Okay, so for you to have a causal hypothesis, which is really what we're then trying to aim for here, is I want to have that relationship between my independent and dependent variable where one of them is absolutely causing the change in the other. For it to be a causal hypothesis, it has to be a prediction. So me saying when number of people who eat ice cream, when people eat 6 more gallons of ice cream, there's a 3% increase in the number of swimming deaths. Right, that's a prediction. But it also then needs to have some rooting in the hypothesis. The hypothesis has to be linked back to the theory. Like, why is it that we would think that eating ice cream causes people to drown? Now, again, that's where my causal hypothesis starts to fall apart between swimming and drowning, right? Because, again, unless you're in that magic 30-minute period, for the most part, we don't think that there's a theory to back up drowning and eating of ice cream. It has to be falsifiable, though. I have to have some way to show that that the independent variable is not causing the dependent variable to change. The thing about hypotheses is that we see that they are refined over time, and in this process what you're seeing here, and this is in 6.3, what you're seeing is that in this hypothesis forming process is that I'm starting to reject hypotheses based on new data as it comes in, and also I am forming new hypotheses as the data comes in. And you can see that over this entire time period that this kind of research, that my hypothesis itself starts to get revised as I capture more data. Now, we also have to think about the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is this idea that the independent variable has no significant effect on the dependent variable. So that would be saying that the two are not related to each other. The alternative hypothesis, it's a hypothesis that I pair with the null hypothesis, and instead it says, no, in fact, the independent variable has a significant impact on the dependent variable. So you can see how those two are the opposing parts of each other. Null hypothesis says there is no relationship between the two. The alternative hypothesis is an incredibly strong relationship between the two. But you don't want to commit a double-barreled hypothesis. This is the one where you have two independent variables, but it's unclear which one is having the effect on the dependent variable. And you see that right here. In this kind of description, what you're seeing is that poverty can lead to crime. High concentration of teens can cause crime. But the problem is, what happens when you have poverty and a high concentration of teens, right? We don't know which one causes crime. But what we could do is maybe we could find some way to talk about how things change significantly when those two coexist or exist together. The interaction effect is absolutely fine. You just don't want to commit the double-barreled hypothesis, which is the one that occurs right here on this third part right here. In So now I basically want to kind of conclude this by talking about a few of the errors that can be made in the explanation process or in the whole research design process. First, we have teleology. And in teleology, the problem that we have here is that that essentially the independent variable and dependent variable, or the thing that's causing and the thing that's the result, that the two are essentially restatements of each other. And so the problem would be is that you can't distinguish them, that they're essentially true by definition. I don't know. Well, I guess the most famous example I can think of as teleology would be Taylor Swift, right? Saying that haters are going to hate. That's a teleological sort of statement, right? Because if I'm saying haters tend to hate, that would seem to illustrate that, right? That is the nature of being a hater, is that you hate. So there's no way to actually test whether how being a hater causes hate, because essentially I'm restating the dependent variable to get the independent variable. In tautology, though, what we're saying here is that the causal factor, we don't know the nature of the relationship between variable 1 and variable 2 because it's just not clear to us. It's a little bit vague why the two would have any relationship to one another. So that basically starts to get resolved as you develop more theory. Then what we have as another error that's made in causal explanations is either the ecological fallacy or the error of reduction. In both of these in both the fallacy, in the ecological fallacy, the problem here is that I'm looking at a problem that exists in the overall world, but then I'm making a generalization and applying it to a small area. But I could be making an overgeneralization, right? And so if I say something like Hawaiians are lazy, right, then that doesn't necessarily apply equally to all of the islands or even all of the, groups, social groups that exist within Hawaii. And then in my error of reduction, it's essentially the exact opposite, where I'm looking at small scale units and overgeneralizing them to the entire population. So instead, that would be me saying, the people that I work with are very hardworking, and then me falsely saying all Hawaiians are incredibly hardworking. They're the exact opposite of each other here. You also want to be careful as you're designing research projects to not engage in spuriousness. That means saying something like, in this example here, saying that TV is making us dumber. That's typically not the case. Right? It's typically the case that people of low cognitive level are getting their news only from TV. They're not reading the newspapers, not engaged in extensive debates. So it's not TV that's causing them to have low levels of knowledge. They were stupid to start with, right? And so in this case, you don't want to say that TV is causing low levels of knowledge and making us dumber. It probably existed before there was the TV. And then this is just a good slide then for making for identifying within your projects that you're not committing one of these errors. Again, I will be looking at your research proposals now that we've finished this chapter, making sure that you are not committing one of these errors.